Good morning. We'll talk today about competitive analytics. We will talk a little bit about metrics and concepts, and this is Dr. Pratham Datta. The essence of analytics lies in thinking strategically but acting on evidence. Evidence alone doesn't allow you to make the next move unless you actually have a plan. On the other hand, if you just want have a plan but you don't have anything to support your convictions or your moves, or whether it's tactical in the short run or strategic in the long run, you might find it very difficult to get things moving. So we're going to start off today with concepts in competitive analytics. So we'll cover all the basic terms and everything that you need to know, but we'll also get into this whole mode of trying to think logically, but also logically with some kind of support using data. Right, so that's the whole idea. We're going to focus on why is it that people use certain things, and how do you get there. But to begin, the first thing I need to mention is I absolutely enjoyed reading your pieces on metrics, but there are certain very interesting issues, and you've tried to address them, and we'll carry on with that discussion as we even move forward. Because you realize what you're looking for when you're saying that a metric that we typically use, you're looking at something called an outcome variable. So, or also known as a dependent variable. So, it's called an outcome or dependent variable. So this whole idea of a dependent variable is we're trying to reach that goal. So what I try to do with that metrics exercise is for you to think of what is the type of outcome that you want? What is the preferred outcome that you want? Now, whether somebody talks about customer experience or freshness of donut or sales volume, the thing is, that's your final objective, and it's very important for us to understand what the final objective is before we try to trace what are the things that affect it. Now, when we meet in class, possibly 2 weeks later, we're going to dig right into creating these kinds of models where we'll be able to understand what are the factors that lead to it. And how do you not only collect data, but once you have data, how could you predict? Firstly, how would you know which one of the factors are the most important? And the second part is, how would you be able to therefore predict, based on what factors are most important, what you ought to focus on in order to reach your final destination? So, as we move forward with it, it's important to know that this choice itself is sort of predicated by multiple different things. And the first piece of the puzzle is something slightly different, which is, let me see if I can open a new page and note a few things. So, suppose you want to, can you guys read the page on the whiteboard? Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you. So suppose you want to check customer experience as they enter a bank. So could somebody be kind enough to start off in terms of, could you tell me the sequence of things that customers do once they enter a bank? And as you keep mentioning them, I'm going to sort of start adding to that set itself. So anybody stand in the queue, all right? Stand Let's
Typically,
see.
they'll like um, walk in and want to either fill out a deposit slip or with like a withdrawal slip.
Very nice. Let's do it in steps. One is they'll stand in queue. Second is make deposit, or let's put it as make a transaction, right? So it could be any kind of transaction. What do they do after that? All right, so you could say they close the transaction, and then of course they leave or exit, right? All right, fair enough. But there's Sky Mask on. Yes, true. You have to do that. That's an imperative. But but anyway, so let's assume you want to look at you want to increase the overall experience that a customer has when he or she enters a bank, right? Or comes to the bank and leaves. So let's why don't you throw me some numbers in terms of, so assume the banks set up a mechanism where they've said that it should be less than 5 minutes that they should stand in line, and you want to look at people's experiences. Now, what would be a percentage of people that you think is a good tolerable percentage where people, you know, for people to be standing for less than 5 minutes? What's a good percentage? So you're looking at how many people ended up standing in line for more than 5 minutes versus less than 5 minutes. What's a good percentage? 95%, 90%? Anybody wants to
I would,
throw me a number?
I would say 95%. I believe it.
So Eric said 85, you say 95. Shall we come to compromise and say 90? Just to give you an example. Fair enough. Now, what about suppose this is, now we're talking about satisfaction with making a transaction. What would be your what would be a decent percentage that you could? Yes, true. I don't know. Let's talk about those geriatrics who go to a bank. Let's not bring. So assume we're talking about geriatric customers in a bank, Janet. Right. All right. So why don't you give me a percentage in terms of satisfaction? Satisfaction. So give me a percentage that's acceptable for you to say that customers satisfied with making a transaction. Yeah, so you're right. Making a transaction, basically, if you were to write it, you'll say that is a function of multiple things, right? Time spent, issues resolved, uh, among many other bits, right? So, but let's give. Why don't you give me a percentage in terms of that was 90%? What would be an acceptable percentage for you to talk about, satisfaction with making a transaction? Anyone?
For a transaction like a deposit or withdrawal,
Yes, a
I would
deposit, a
expect it should
withdrawal,
be
a
greater than
balance check.
95%.
95, all right, fair enough. 95%. Thank you. What about closing the transaction, which is making sure that they have all the information they need, whatever bank card that they were given, everything's done. What percentage? What's a decent with how the transaction was closed and
I
ended?
I I would even say it's 100% because
All right, fair enough.
95
Uh,
that 5% could have a detrimental effect on some of the transactions
true,
or the
true,
customer
true.
events. So
All right, fair enough. So closing the transaction, 100%, and leaving how, whether it's entering the bank. So let's say enter and leave. So how easy is it to sort of access the bank in general? So accessing the bank, um, what would be a decent percentage for you to say that, all right, people are satisfied with, um, you know, the way, how easy it is to access the bank, enter the bank, leave the bank, and so forth? True, yes, Jamie writes. There are way more transactions, so let's assume we're lumping all the transactions together because then we'll start adding a little bit to it to figure out where these differences even lie. So it's more than deposits and withdrawals. You're dealing with so many different things. So, but assume it's still your satisfaction with making a transaction. And enter and leave, assume you say that as long as 90% of people are happy with the ease of accessing the bank and the ease of exiting the bank and so forth, right? You're not, parking isn't a big problem. There isn't an issue in terms of, whether it's a door issue or something like that. None of those things would matter. So let's put it at 90%. So here's my question to you. What is the overall customer satisfaction with the bank? So could anybody try and guess what would be all right, so I think Adam mentioned 99%, so let's change it to 99%. So what is the overall? Oh, all right, that very, very nice. So Jamie, brilliant point. So weights are very important, which one is more important, which one is less important. But let's revisit it in possibly 5 minutes, because that's going to be the next part of this story. So let's first say that assume right now you've got, so these are, as you would call them, activities, and now you have weights. Now if we don't assign separate weights, we basically say there are 4 activities, 100 divided by 4 would be 25%, so these are 25% each, right? Sorry, let's see. 25% each. Fair enough. And so what is right now, what's the total experience of customers in the bank? Anyone? Jamie, Matthew, Eric, Adam, anyone? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I think we're all just trying to do the math.
Ah, right, okay. Cool.
93.75%.
93. Now, how did you get that number?
Sorry, I was actually just looking at wrong numbers here. I apologize.
No, that's all right. But if you just tell me how you're even getting at it, that'd be lovely.
Total all the percentages, and then divide by 4.
See, all right. So one way you could say is it's average, right? It's the average of all of them. So and then you just basically do the averages, and you get. And what are you getting when you're talking about the averages? What are the averages? Or what's the average in this case?
The average is 96%, and most people.
So average is 96. The question is, so average is equal to 96 because all you're doing is, which is 90 plus 95 plus 100 plus 99 divided by 4. The question that I'm going to ask you is, do you think that's the right value for your customer experience? So are you saying that your average customer satisfaction with, or customer experience satisfaction is a 96%? Yes, and of course, in this case, if you were to think of it as a weighted set, all you are doing in the process is you're saying it's 0.25 times 90 plus 0.25 times 95 and so forth, and you're saying that right now it's basically, that's why if it's 0.25, all it means is divided by 4. Fair enough, but how many of you agree that 96% is the right number? Manuel, you say it's not the right number, so why not, Manuel?
Yeah, because I believe we need to. I don't know the number if you include the weights, but I believe we need to do this including the weights.
All right, no, but think of it. The minute you're averaging it, you're already including the weights. That's why it's averaged by 4, right? So if you were to calculate it as, let's see, let's go back to this and say, let me see if I can get this.
With all these having the same weight, the average is going to come out to the same number, but I personally wouldn't rate them the same, because if I had to stand in line for 15 minutes, it's going to totally ruin my experience with going to the bank.
Fair enough. So yes. So let's get to the weights in a second. Let me see. Get my calculator. So let's do this. So the answer is a very interesting one. So let me create a new set and tell you something interesting. The answer is not the average. You know why? The response is overall customer experience, because each issue is leading to the next, is basically 0.9 times, and then we'll get to the weights, times 0.95 times 1 times 0.99, which is equal to, anyone? So, Manuel, for example, if you don't find a place to park, that's your entry and exit issue, and that's a big issue, right? So what number do you get now? Very nice. You get 84.6%. It's oftentimes, it's an anomaly that, or oftentimes we run foul by basically saying, well, it's the average. No. It's because it's a sequence. See, that's why I asked you, what's the sequence? Which basically means now if you were to check this and say that, all right, I want to know how well we performed on this metrics of overall customer experience. Each set, very much like what you study when you're compounding, it's a compounding effect that goes on. So, in this case, if each of them have equal weights, the answer is going to be exactly the same again, right? 84.6%. Let me ask you, what would be weights you would assign to them? So how would you change the weights in this case? Give me some new weights. Standing in the cube, what percentage would you, all right, what percentage would you assign to it? So I see Karen mentioned that making a transaction is the most important, so you want to assign it a 50% weight. What about standing in queue? 35%? Now do realize they all have to add up to about, actually not about, to 100%. So which basically means you've got 15% left. How are you going to distribute the 15% across the sets? Ten, 5, all right, 10%, and 5%. All right, fair enough. So now let's revisit this and do the same and run the same set. So now your overall customer experience is equal to, anybody help me with the calculation, is going to be what? Any shout outs, any brave hearts, come on. 0.35 times 0.9 plus 0.5 times 0.95 plus 0.1 times 1. Right, guys, everybody?
94%.
And you've calculated it's 94%, right? And 0.05 times 99. So this comes up to 94%, does it? Everybody able to get the same number? Perfect, right? So now the minute you're assigning different weights, you see that this basic set of 84.6%. So if you were to say they're all equally important, first realize it's not the average. It's always anything that's in a sequence. So the reason why I'm mentioning it is, next time you start looking at your, as I mentioned previously, you could have the best analytics, you would have the best minds, but if you don't have a good sense of the process, you're likely to end up choosing the wrong set in terms of what to assign and when to assign. So the first bit is, anytime you're trying to make anything better in your company, firstly look at the steps that people have to follow from entry to exit. Once you've got your entry to exit mapped out, specify all the steps, which is nothing but your general workflow, whether you're looking at your customer workflows or you're looking at your internal employee workflow, whether you're managing workflow for your team or you're managing workflow for your customers. So you're looking at workflow. Once you've got your workflows in order, then the thing is, understand the sequence. Now for each sequence, try and ask what is historically assigned as a nice tolerable level of performance. Percentages. Once you've got your entire sequence in order, then calculate your set without changing weights. Then change weights and see how that changes. And assume, so see, most of the time, these new weights that you provide, right? These are very interesting weights, but the question is, who should assign these weights? Management or customers? And the response typically would be what? Who should be assigning these weights? 35%, 50%? Very good. So the idea is, well, you could say management can assign weights, but here's the tricky bit, right? As we talked about, that metrics itself, analytics are tricky because it changes the definition. Because the question is, who changes the definition? If you hand it to management in terms of what would be a good weight, management could oftentimes assign a certain weight that makes this number look better. Because all they want to do is change the weights, play around with the weights where the numbers look better. But the question is, if you're really getting to if you really want to increase customer experience, the customers ought to be asked in terms of wherein would you place more emphasis versus wherein would you place less emphasis, right? And that oftentimes becomes the case, right? So that oftentimes becomes the case. So it's very, very important to realize that most processes, if not all, in any organization, is a sequence of processes. Every sequence has a certain task, a certain activity. Every activity ought to be understood and thought of in terms of what would define a good performance rate for that activity. Once you've known what's a good performance rate for that activity, your next stop is knowing, all right, your experience requires you to understand activities working together and in sequence, not separately. The minute you think it's separate, then what you'll do is you might, there are many different groups. Some group will say that, well, I'm just going to choose the minimum because the minimum is going to be the weakest link. True. But given the fact that you're getting 90% satisfaction standing in a queue, you already are dissatisfied. Your dissatisfaction now with the 95% of the transaction gets compounded. And after that, entry leaving, even with that, the 99%, which is the 1% that's missing, is going to compound on that. So you have to, sorry, can't you hear it? Can you hear me now? Can you guys still hear me? Brilliant, cool, sweet, thank you very much. So got to put that sequence in order. Thank you very much, thank you. You've got to put that sequence in order, and for each activity in a sequence, understand the overall impact. So next time you're checking for overall impact, anything that is based on a sequence or one depends on the other. For example, I remember as I was absolutely marveling reading your responses on metrics, I remember one of you mentioned something in terms of demand forecasting. And then, of course, the thing is, if you're looking at demand forecasting based on SKUs and pallet sizes and lot sizes and so forth, one thing affects the other. So yes, true. And because one thing affects the other, everything works as a process. So at the end of the day, your total experience is also a mechanism to, as Jamie rightly mentions, both identify and improve on processes, because that becomes your central cog. If that is missed out, then you can have the best metric, but you wouldn't really know exactly where to fix it. Given the fact that the starting end, if you again look at it, standing in queue, making a transaction, closing the transaction, there are companies that love to create this sense of what's your primary association, what's your catch. And if you know what your catches are, then you know these are the points where we need to improve the most, because that's what customers truly want from us. That's what our suppliers want from us. That's what our internal employees want from us, and so forth. Did I actually make sense? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So let's get on to useful analytical concept. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention was there was one metric that somebody remarked in something, if it's a very subjective metric. For example, if you're talking about, for example, something very amorphous, like whether something is fresh. And if I were to ask you, how on earth do you measure freshness? So if I were to ask you, how do you measure freshness? What's a metric, or what would be, of course, anything that's amorphous requires more dimensions, right? And so the idea is anything that is amorphous in nature requires more dimensions, because you're trying to use multiple dimensions to get at it. So if I were to ask you freshness, so let's call freshness as f is a function of, so or depends upon what, freshness depends upon what. So if you ever walk into a boulangerie and say that, all right, I like, I don't know, a certain baguette or a certain souffle or whatever it is, a tart, and they give you something, all right, so all right, visual appearance, even though it's a bit deceiving sometimes, texture, flavor, anything else, time, aroma, right? So date and time, right? Time, so in this case you'd say time that's passed already. A time sitting. See, taste, right? Very nice. So assume we stop it there. And then the question becomes, if each is the case, do you have a mechanism to check? So so here's the interesting thing. So how do you think, as Jamie mentioned, there's something called determined shelf life. How does a company define a predetermined shelf life? You see that marked on just about every single container, whether you're purchasing milk, says use by. What is this whole idea of use by? And so you would say that these use by depends upon historical data in terms of what goes wrong, where it happens, with, of course, certain assumptions. Where is it kept? Was it constantly in the freezer? Or was it constantly in a fridge? Was the supply chain carrying it through something called a cold supply chain, which is maintaining the same temperature across the entire set? So they can look at historical data using a series of assumptions, but then you have to ask yourself, is there a mechanism to assign how you could check for, or how could you objectify visual appearance? How would you objectify texture? How do you objectify flavor? How do you, well, this is an objective bit anyway, time sitting. Now, time sitting, what I'm trying to get at is, next time you look at a set of metrics or a set of dimensions that even define a metric, get into the core of, all right, time sitting. Is it time sitting from the minute it was prepared, or time sitting from the time it was delivered, or the time sitting from the time it was shelved? Each one has a different time sitting agenda, and the window can itself change exactly what. So it depends on exposures, right? So multiple different things, right? If it's suddenly, it's sitting in the sun, sitting in the shade, right? And you see these stories about, the very famous wines like Chateaubriand or Chateau Margaux or Chateau Lafite, that, of course, you might get a fantastic bottle of 1956 Chateau Lafite or a 68 Chateaubriand, and it's brilliant, but it's only brilliant to hold and to remark upon. It's likely that it's an absolutely shoddy bit to drink, mainly because you really don't know what the exposures have been, where it has been, whether it's been corked, and that's why they're always so worried. Things like exposure to light, temperature, oxygen, safer, right? That's why it's so difficult to ever create a set and know that, all right, this bottle is absolutely perfect. So whenever you're talking about things that are very amorphous in nature, you have to figure out that, and again, same thing, right, as Mahmoud mentions, transportation, but the transportation, as I was mentioning, the use of transportation mechanism, especially for things like drugs and things like milk and all that stuff, called a cold supply chain, where they try to maintain exactly the same temperature and pressure and exposure points across the entire supply chain. The whole idea is, as if exposure changes, the entire metric itself is going to fall flat on its back. So it's important for you to understand the dimensions and find a mechanism to objectify dimensions. And that's why it's important for you to figure out, how do you measure each of them? And once you have a series of experts, whether you're using, we'll talk about techniques and so forth a little later, but even if you're using a set of experts, which is called a Delphi technique, using a set of experts to come up with weights or dimensions, is called Delphi technique. And of course, if some of you visited Greece, you see the very famous the Delphi temple, and it also is a place where it's the same technique, where you ask the question and you start with a large brainstorm, and then you make it slightly smaller, and then you ask them to prioritize and make it even smaller till you come to a sort of a consensus amongst a bunch of experts, and the experts typically ought to be people from multiple fields, which is, for example, if you're looking at a bank, it should look at overall customer satisfaction. If it's overall transactional satisfaction, you want to bring in the customers, you want to bring in the branch managers, you want to bring in the tellers, because a customer might, want to get something done, but frankly speaking, if the teller has to click through 10 different processes to give the customer a response, it just takes a lot of time. So you've got to bring in the right pieces of the puzzle that can actually come up with the right attributions and the right dimensions for you to even measure them. Does that sound fair? So again, two important bits we covered. Firstly, understanding the fact that you need to, whenever you're trying to measure things, to finish off this whole measurement, if any of your metrics is dependent on a sequence of activities, consider performance at every single piece of the activity, and realize that at the end of the day, it's a compounded effect that defines the total experience. The second piece of the puzzle is, if it's a metric that is somewhat nebulous or amorphous in nature, which is, it's very subjective, try to break it down into pieces that get closer and closer to a mechanism to actually measure it, and a mechanism to measure it properly.